Well, how do power dynamics change when you move to virtual meetings rather than in person meetings? My guest today is Laura Simpson. She's Chief Intelligence Officer at McCann Worldgroup, and she joins me to talk about the research her organization has done on this subject. Hi, Laura.
Hi.
I understand you're joining me from Essex in the UK. This is a global issue.
It is a global issue. Yeah, and I'm in a really fortunate position because we collect data from lots of different markets around the world. So we're able to look at, how all kinds of different people are wrestling with the changing dynamics around the pandemic.
Lots to talk about there. I like to talk to my guests about their own backgrounds first, actually, because it's so interesting to find out how people ended up doing what they're doing. Can you just give us a brief synopsis of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I started off in market research more than 20 years ago. So sort of specializing in qualitative and quantitative research. And then I transitioned into advertising and marketing. And I've had various roles over the years, sort of sometimes more trends centric, but also always with kind of research and culture at the core. And yeah, I've been at McCann Worldgroup for quite a while. I worked in New York. I'm now based back in London again, but my role is global. So I'm as you said, the Chief Intelligence Officer of McCann Worldgroup. So yeah, so I spend a lot of time looking at data and thinking about what makes humans tick.
And over the years, I guess you spent a lot of time in meetings.
I
As we all
have.
have. Let's go back to pre-pandemic. I mean, there were some things we have observed about how people come together and who speaks and who gets heard. What are the things that stand out to you?
Yeah, I mean, I've been reflecting on this subject a lot as we've kind of transitioned into more and more virtual meetings and now the kind of hybrid world. So, I think like a lot of people, I've been thinking about going back to the way things were and reflecting on, what were in real life meetings like. And obviously there are lots of fantastic things about being with people in person, but one of the things I was reflecting on is, particularly, years and years ago when I first started out in my career, how challenging I found meetings as a junior person. I actually found them really, really intimidating. I found it really hard to speak up. And I felt somehow that my value at work was kind of tied up with how well I could perform in a meeting. And I was kind of reflecting on that and thinking, I wonder if some of that anxiety has gone away, like in a virtual world where people aren't sitting around a boardroom table anymore, and kind of all of those old dynamics have been challenged. So yeah, I've been thinking about that and reflecting on that a lot from a personal point of view, but also through the lens of our data.
Well, for sure, when I think about the years when I was junior in my job, I started as an economist, we'd have all these people around a table. Everyone had done pretty good work, but there were people who dominated, right? And it's a certain personality type.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because when I first started first started work, as I said, I was working in market research. So one of the things I learned to do at the beginning of my career was to moderate focus groups. And that's a very specific skill and it requires training. And one of the things that you get taught to do is look out for dominant respondents. So these are people who hijack the conversation. Yes. They want to talk the whole time. It's very hard for other people to speak. And one of the tips I was given is, a dominant respondent will often sit directly opposite you, or they will sit next to you. So I just became really sensitized to this idea of, I guess, dominance in a meeting, who had control, where was the power. And, I would just sit back and spend time observing that, particularly as a junior person who was moderating groups and also comparing that to being in agency meetings and meetings with clients. So yeah, it's definitely something I've thought about, and I'm very aware of who speaks most, where's the power, and are we creating an environment that's inclusive? Are there things that aren't being said because we haven't created the right conditions in that meeting to get contributions from everyone?
Well, I mean, to an extent, we hired for this, correct? I mean, the person who could express themselves well. And we were told, I mean, I think about it as a young woman coming into banking or whatever, learn to be the person who speaks up at a meeting and sit somewhere that's not in the back and where people can see you.
Yeah.
So now we're virtual. So
Yeah.
what has changed now that we've thrown away some of the norms?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, so much has changed. But the comment you just made there made me think about, one of the other things we've been exploring in our research to do with kind of like extroverts versus introverts. And I think this is something that people have been reflecting on more and more over the course of the pandemic. It's something people have been talking about a lot on social media. If you are an introvert, how have you found the pandemic? How do you prefer to interact with people? And we saw in our data that actually quite a lot of people, I think around a third of people, said they felt a little bit more introverted as a result of the pandemic, right? Because they haven't had as much, obviously, social interaction over the last couple of years. But I think one of the things that I've noticed in virtual meetings is, they can be really good for introverts because we have the chat bar, right? Because we have this kind of multi-layered meeting that is allowing for people to interact in different ways, to contribute in a way that best suits them. And I find that really fascinating. And I want to make sure that as we move into a hybrid world, as we start to do more and more physical meetings, that we don't lose that. Because I think, I've benefited from that over the last couple of years. I have read things in the chat that I think that's it, like that's the thing. And that person wasn't going to say that out loud in front of the group.
It's a real shift, though. I mean, getting back to who you hire, now you're hiring for skills, right? You're talking about the person who has these great thoughts and is able to contribute it in this meeting. Otherwise, that person probably wasn't valued as highly because you may never have heard that thought.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, to be honest, when I think about things that kind of keep me up at night, when I think about my role or the future of our industry, and I think about DE&I and inclusivity and belonging and how important that is to the future of our industry. And then I think about all of those thoughts and ideas we are hemorrhaging on a daily basis because they're getting lost in the way that we set up meetings and the way that we interact. How many thoughts are just staying in people's heads because we haven't created the right conditions for those thoughts to be shared. And that's one of the things I have loved about the virtual meeting. I feel like I'm seeing more of those. And the other thing I really love, and again, I can only speak from my own experience in the meetings that I've been in at McCann Worldgroup, is sometimes you'll see this thing where someone shares a thought in the chat, and maybe it's the first time they've shared something, and then you'll just see these hearts and these thumbs up popping up on the message. And I think that's so reassuring to that person. And then it encourages them to say something else, right? Because they get that immediate sense of, oh, like my contribution is worthwhile, my contribution is valued. So what's the equivalent of that in a physical meeting? Like, how do we make sure that we continue some of those positive cultural changes that I think have emerged as a result of virtual work?
And you've done research on how people view this, right, in terms of women, men, people from different ethnic groups, whatever. What have you found there?
Yeah, really, really interesting. We found that actually, so in our research, we asked people whether they self-identify as being part of a minority group. And we found that if you self-identify as being part of a minority group, you were significantly more likely to say that remote working has helped your working life. You're more likely to say that remote working and virtual working has increased diversity and inclusivity at your company. And interestingly, the younger you are, the more likely you are to think that as well. So really, really fascinating. Obviously, I've got thoughts on why we're seeing those differences in the data. And of course, it isn't, like with any data set, it isn't a universal experience. So, obviously there are people who are part of minority groups or younger people who are, you know, desperate to get back to the office and haven't enjoyed virtual working. But, you know, from a data point of view, it certainly looks like, you know, it's benefited those groups in certain ways.
You know, it's interesting because I've read the opposite as well. I've read this, and I've also read that some people, particularly from, you know, specific backgrounds, don't want people seeing their homes, right? And the office is a bit of an equalizer. Have you come across that at all?
Yeah, that's very interesting, isn't it? We didn't see that specifically in the research about people not wanting to see their homes. We did see around younger employees, for example, this idea that obviously missing the social interaction, missing the chance to socialize with colleagues, missing the opportunity to potentially see you know, older employees kind of modeling certain behaviors in the office. So I know I've certainly seen that from younger people, and obviously I think for some people, a lot of parents, you know, there is an upside to working from home in terms of flexibility. But for other parents, you know, it's, you know, if you don't have the right environment, you know, I'm very, very fortunate that I have a separate space to work in. Obviously, lots of people aren't as fortunate as I am. You know, if you have a chaotic situation at home or a situation that's harder to control, of course, you know, it's easier for you to be in the office. But I think for me, where this all sort of nets out is it's not that, you know, one virtual work is good and work in the office is bad, or work in the office is good and virtual work is bad. You know, I think both of these things are just tool sets. And like everything, it's about how we use those tools and how we empower people to use them and kind of advise them, you know, in terms of how best to use them. Because let's face it, you know, we've all been in horrible virtual meetings. Absolutely. You know, all of us. And we've all probably been in horrible, you know, real world physical meetings as well. And that was nothing to do with the tool set or the physical space. Well, actually, it may have been to do with the tool. I know that there are technology failures that have definitely made virtual meetings bad, but, you know, more likely it's to do with the way you've set up the meeting or the way people are interacting or not having the right objective for the meeting. So yes, I think obviously all of these tools can be used to great effect or can be used in a negative way as well.
Laura, do you have a view on leaving your camera on? It's kind of a controversial issue, right? Some people think it's okay to shut it off. Some people think it should always be on.
Yeah, it's really interesting. In general, I think that it's better if people have their cameras on. Like when I have meetings with my team, I like people to have their cameras on because I think to some extent, it's about creating sort of mutual respect within the group, right? We are virtual, but we are here together and I'm listening to you. Like I'm here, I'm present, I'm listening. At the same time, I also want to create an environment at work where at any point someone feels comfortable and safe to say to me, I'm going to keep my camera off today, if that's okay. Like I need a break from the screen. I've got other things going on. Like I'm going to be there, I'm listening, but just so you know, and I am 100% fine with that. So for me, it's about the norm should be, let's have our cameras on as much as possible, because I think it actually creates a feeling of equity and collaboration. But we should be very understanding that there are times when people need to turn their camera off.
Okay, let's move forward. We're going to get into some kind of post-pandemic reality. We're going to go back to offices, but we're never going to get rid of this virtual world, right? So what are the lessons that managers, organizations should be taking from this and applying?
From the
experience of being virtual for so long.
Virtual, yeah. Yes. So many lessons. I think for me, one of the key lessons, I guess, is to not, it's sort of going to sound quite big, but I think sometimes there's a tendency in businesses to think, you know, obviously just because we've always done this a certain way, this is the way that we should continue to do it. And then we've had this huge enforced disruption, and we've all realized that actually our businesses can thrive in ways that we didn't appreciate, that we didn't expect that to work. So I think for me, we just have to be open to completely reimagining models and the way things work from a working point of view. I think that's a big one. I think, going back to what I was saying earlier, some of those lessons that we may have learned about inclusivity and diversity and how to make sure that we're getting those democratic meetings that are like true levelers. How do we keep hold of that magic and make sure that also works in a hybrid world? I think, for us as a global organization, it's been huge because for a long time, pretty much my whole job, I've worked in a global organization. And I think as a global organization, we are pretty networked, we're pretty connected, but I have never felt more connected as a global organization in the last year, because suddenly I am in meetings with people from all over the world, and we're all there together looking at each other, and we move around on time zones to make it as democratic as possible, whereas before it would have been a far sketchier situation, kind of like some people on the phone, some people in the room, it just didn't feel like a democratic, global, inclusive situation, and now it does. So we need to not lose sight of that. I think from a hiring point of view, one of the things I'm so excited about is this idea that it's given me, in my mind, a more expansive talent pool. And I'm really excited by the fact that I can look for talent in places that perhaps I wasn't considering before. So actually, we've just hired someone new for our team in the UK who's based up in Manchester, and she's going to come down to London probably every couple of weeks. But honestly, prior to the pandemic, I wouldn't have considered hiring someone outside of London, because to the point I made at the beginning, I was like, well, this is how it works. Like, we're in London, we're in the city of London. I need people who work close to London and can commute in. Mm-hmm. Suddenly I'm like, I can just find the best person.
That's cool.
I can find the best person, and again, from a DE&I point of view, if I find someone who physically finds it hard to come into the office, or for whatever reason, for me, that's no longer a barrier. Like, I'm excited that I have new opportunities to hire people that, again, may not have been considered before because of this barrier we had around the physical office.
Okay, and in terms of the physical office, I know we had hybrid meetings before the pandemic. You'd have a screen up and you'd see the person. Do you think we need to change things now that we're making this more permanent? We're going to have this mix? Because we're changing everything. We can change the physical structures too.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I think we're going to need to be very thoughtful in terms of how we use technology meetings and what kind of technology. And as we know, obviously there are all kinds of companies now that are helping us to visualize that future. One of the things we've been doing as we transition into this world of hybrid work is do what we call, we call them experiments. So every meeting is an experiment, and we will try different things. And then after the meeting, we will have almost like a post-mortem with the attendees, and we say, hey, how did that work? How was it for you? Like, how could we have made it better? So to give you an example of that, a few weeks ago, we ran a workshop, and we really wanted it to be like a workshop, like people in a room, sticking things on walls, being really creative together, except for we had some people in New York and we had some people in London. And there were more people in New York, so they were all in the room together. And then there were a couple of people joining. And it was really interesting learning, because I was one of the people joining virtually, and everyone in the meeting had their laptop on their knees, and they were like looking in, they were on Teams, basically. They were looking into their laptops. And it was interesting because as a virtual participant, I felt almost like a little bit guilty, like, oh, they're having to change the way they're interacting because I'm here. And at the same time, they were like, no, it's fine. But even that was an interesting learning around that dynamic and kind of how we how we just think through some of these new challenges. And, again, from my point of view as a virtual participant, I found it really, really tiring. Like 2 hours of this kind of like creative meeting. It wasn't like being in a workshop where you're kind of all bouncing off each other's energy. And we spoke about it afterwards, and one of the suggestions that we talked about was, rather than just doing everything via laptop, like, is there a moment where you switch to phone, and then if you're moving around the room, I can at least feel like I'm moving around the room as a virtual participant. Like, I felt like I needed a change of energy as much as everyone in the room needed a change of energy, because I was the person who was sitting there staring at a screen. So yeah, I think that idea of thinking about meetings, hybrid meetings, as experiments and testing and learning in every single interaction and meeting is really important, because we're not going to get it right straight away. It's going to take a while for us to figure this out.
Yeah, very much a work in progress. Laura, thank you so much for talking to me today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.